Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and lots of love to you. I do hope you're doing great. And go and get yourself something lovely to drink, because we're on part 4 of our story now, and it's very exciting. Gemma has just had the most phenomenal Bigfoot encounter, literally had her life saved by a female Bigfoot, because there was a male Bigfoot that she was spying on, who had felt her presence and was so infuriated. His name was Kramala, and he was coming right after her, and luckily the female Bigfoot diverted Kramala's attention away from where Gemma actually was and directed her to safety. So now she's returned home, but some rather unusual things have happened. It looks as if somebody has been in her house, tampering with the baby, changing its onesie and stuff like that, and the milk from the fridge had disappeared. So it's very interesting. And before we continue with our story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 4 of our story. Mrs. Warmonger felt reasonably startled when Gemma impudently slammed the door in her face. How could that woman be so audaciously bad-mannered when she was doing what Mr. Songbird had specifically asked of her to do, by checking up on Gemma to see if she was all right, which she did religiously at least once a day. Mr. Songbird had told her about his wife's postnatal depression that she'd been suffering from. The fact that Mrs. Songbird had sauntered off to take a stroll on the beach without her baby was not acceptable, as a mother needed to watch over her younglings 24/7. Everybody knew that. It only took a second for something to go badly wrong. Mrs. Warmonger tattered under her breath and made her way back to her half of the cottage. Good job I was able to look after little Molly when Gemma's back was turned, she thought to herself satisfactorily. Goodness gracious me, it was heedlessly negligent for her to leave her baby unattended like that. Mrs. Warmonger smiled to herself as she thought about the joy she'd experienced holding the real-life bundle in her arms, and remembering the bliss she felt as Molly's innocent bright blue eyes stared up into hers. Little Molly had taken to Mrs. Warmonger at once, chuckling happily in her arms, reaching her chubby little arm out in order to pull at Mrs. Warmonger's cameo brooch. "You like it, do you, Molly? Well, I must admit you've got very good taste," said Mrs. Warmonger. "It's a brooch, if you must know. I wear it because it looks very pretty. It was given to me by my late father." Little Molly stared at the brooch with a big smile on her face, as if she perfectly understood Mrs. Warmonger's words. "You're a clever little thing, are you not? Bonny too, if I have to say so," she had said. The baby had chuckled, as if she agreed. "Yes, you are, she teased, rocking the baby up and down in her arms. When Mrs. Warmonger had purchased Viola and Daisy online, they had looked like real-life babies. That was the idea of these dolls, to look extremely realistic. She had ordered dresses for them, bottles of fake milk, and she would place them in their cots every single night and read them a bedtime story. It was the nearest thing for her to experience what it felt like to be a mother. Gemma Songbird had no idea how blessed she was to have such a perfect little baby like Molly, that was so dependent on her. What must it feel like to be so needed, Mrs. Warmonger wondered. She was extremely envious of Gemma for being a mother. She couldn't help but feel a touch of the green-eyed monster. Mrs. Warmonger shook her head in contemptuous disdain. Some people really didn't deserve to be mothers, did they, she thought pitifully, and Gemma Songbird was one of these people. Mrs. Warmonger's real-life dolls, Viola and Daisy, were in high demand on the internet, and both dolls had filled a vacuously empty hole in her life. But after holding little Gemma in her arms, her 2 dolls lying in the cots in the nursery had lost their appeal, for holding the real thing was just so much better. Mrs. Warmonger also considered Brandy, her beloved, rather self-entitled cat, to be one of her children. But Brandy had a mind of his own, and was fiercely independent, but the dolls had always been dependent on Mrs. Warmonger, and she loved the feeling of being needed, for it gave her life purpose. Mrs. Warmonger had felt so much joy, warming up Gemma's breast milk that she'd found in the refrigerator in a bottle to the perfect temperature for little Molly, Molly had seemed quite hungry. She had rocked Molly lovingly in her arms and sung her a lullaby, which Molly seemed to appreciate. Gemma had gone off to the beach and was gone for what seemed like an awfully long time, and had returned back from her walk looking exceedingly dishevelled, almost as if she'd been having a love affair with a thorny bush of brambles or something. Furthermore, she looked as pale as a piece of paper, as if she had had a nasty shock of some kind. Maybe she'd fallen, because sometimes the cliffs could be quite steep. It impelled Mrs. Warmonger to pop around to check on the woman, to see if she was all right. Mrs. Warmonger had a spare key to Gemma's side of the cottage, so when Gemma's back had been turned, Mrs. Warmonger had taken the liberty to check on little Molly. "That woman just doesn't deserve to be a mother," she told herself very firmly, for what must have been the zillionth time. "When I was her age, I would have done almost anything to have a baby," she thought resentfully. "But this younger generation don't appreciate a good thing when it's staring them directly in the face." Mrs. Warmonger held a prolonged bitterness in her heart to God, for the barrenness that she had suffered from for all her life, and now, of course, at her age, having a baby was impossible. Many times she had negotiated with God when she was a lot younger, that he'd give her a baby, for she would have done anything, even if it meant standing on a street corner, in the pouring rain, witnessing to people about the goodness of God. If she'd had to, she would certainly have done it. It would seem her prayers had fallen on deaf ears, and so her faith had been significantly diminished. And over the years she had become very embittered. She had stopped going to church altogether. Why on earth should she worship a God who had denied her the pleasure of becoming a mother? She thought back to when she had first met Boris Warmonger all those years ago. She had been a beautiful woman back then, before the bitterness had entered her heart that had robbed her of her fine features. It had been love at first sight, when Peggy had first laid eyes on Boris at church, when the congregation had gathered together for coffee after the service. Boris had looked straight at Peggy, their eyes had met, and there had been something special that occurred between them, as if sparks of electricity were flying. Alas, Peggy had not seen Boris again, until miraculously out of the blue there he was at the library where she worked as the head librarian, asking about a book he was looking for. The two of them had got talking, and Boris admitted he'd asked the pastor, "Who is that woman? Who is that woman?" The pastor had told Boris who Peggy was and where she worked, so he'd sniffed her out of the library, and then pretended to show an interest in a book that he was looking for, so that he could get to know her better. The two of them had become lovebirds. Peggy Warmonger had been swept off her feet. They had both rushed off to get married in a civil ceremony. They had talked tirelessly like a pair of excited teenagers about having over a dozen children, as Peggy Warmonger had longed to become a mother. Boris Warmonger wanted children even more than Peggy did, if that was at all possible. He also talked incessantly about having lots and lots of children running around the front yard. Peggy was absolutely delighted to have met someone in her life who was on exactly the same page as she was. 3 years had gone by, and unfortunately, Peggy had failed to fall pregnant, and this was not something that had gone down very well with Boris, who became increasingly disenchanted. He would return from work with a significant frown on his face and say, "Have you done another pregnancy test?" Peggy would nod her head sadly and say, "I'm sorry, Boris. I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm just not pregnant." "But I don't understand. We've been trying hard to have a baby, and nothing has happened. Is there something wrong with you, Peggy?" he had demanded rather ruefully. "Of course there's nothing wrong with me," Peggy had shouted back rather fiercely. "Why would there be anything wrong with me, Boris? Maybe you're the problem. Why do men always believe that the woman is at fault when they're not getting pregnant? You may have a poor sperm count for all we know. It does happen." "It's not the problem. I'm not the problem," Boris had insisted. "I certainly do not believe I have a poor sperm count. I think that is highly unlikely. And, Peggy, I take offence to your insinuation. That is not what is going on here. We need to go and see a specialist at once and to find out what the hell is going on with us. And I will put money on the fact that I'm not the problem," he had said obstinately. When Peggy Warmonger had been told by the fertility specialist that she was not capable of having children, she'll never forget the way that Boris Warmonger had looked at her. It was almost as if in an instant that the love that he had held towards his wife had died just like that, dissipating from his heart like the smoke from a chimney. "You are not the woman I thought you were," he told her after their appointment with the specialist. "You heard it from the horse's mouth himself. You are incapable, Peggy, of having children. This is not what I signed up for. I wanted lots of kids, and I made that clear to you. So what we have together will never work out." "But we could adopt, Boris. That's a possibility, you know." Boris had looked disgusted at the very idea of adopting somebody else's children. "Are you insane, Peggy? I don't want other people's children. That is not my blood that will be running through their veins. I want my very own, my own progeny. Is that so hard for you to understand?" "But we could get a surrogate mother to carry our babies for us," Peggy had suggested. "There are women willing to do this." "I want a simple life, Peggy. I don't need all the fuss of complications. I'm sorry, but it can never work out between us. I want to file for divorce as soon as possible." Peggy's heart had hardened towards all men after that, when she had been brusquely disregarded by Boris. He no longer wanted her because she was not capable of having his children, and that had been that. It had been a cruel blow to her that had turned her as bitter as gall. She remembered hearing that within weeks of the divorce that Boris had married someone else, a woman called April, and within months April had become pregnant with Boris's first baby. The woman had gone on to have 12 more children, and Peggy had spied on the family on one occasion playing ball together in the yard. Boris had a huge grin on his face, and his plump wife looked as if there was a permanent smile on her face as well. Peggy had sat in the car watching Boris's family having so much fun together. It was the first time she had wept and wept, so much so that there were no more tears left to cry. She had cried for what could have been. If God had made her womb fruitful, that is, then this would have been the life that she and Boris would have shared together. She would be running after 12 children and have had a full life. Peggy's own parents had looked on Peggy as the black sheep in their family. Even her own father had grumbled at her very discontentedly. "You were married to such a nice man. Boris was a very good man. You wanted lots of children, but he dumped you, and I don't blame him for that, for someone better than you. There's nothing worse than being married to a woman who is incapable of getting pregnant. You must have done something wrong for God to have turned his back on you like this and failed to bless your womb." Peggy's own mother had not been kind either. Her mother had nodded her head and said, "I agree with your father, Peggy. The fact that you are unable to have children is a punishment from God. That's the way I see it. There is no doubt about that in my mind. You have offended God in some way. You reap what you sow, Peggy, dear." Peggy had become estranged from her family. She'd moved away from Ohio as quickly as she could, and had never ever been back again, even after her parents had died. So yes, Peggy Warmonger had a lot to be bitter about. When she attended Boris's funeral 5 years ago, there hadn't been a dry eye in the church. Everybody had been devastated about his passing. The place had been packed with his children and grandchildren. The pastor had gone on to give an unblemished eulogy about Boris and his life, about what an exceptional father, grandfather, and a loving man he was. Boris's wife April had been beside herself with grief, as she clung to the coffin in the church, crying her heart out. Even Peggy had felt rather sorry for her, but she'd left the church feeling all the more disgruntled about the years she had lost. Peggy had spent 30 years living at Dreamy Heights, overseeing the visitors that came to stay here for holiday breaks, but it was only after the songbirds had come and brought their little baby Molly along, and she'd held Molly in her arms, that the deadness in her heart seemed to have come alive again. She was like a dead tree that suddenly began to grow some green shoots. Little Molly had brought a happy smile to her face, and Peggy Warmonger had not smiled for many long years. So much so, many people thought she was incredibly formidable. When Bernie returned home that evening and entered the kitchen, hell awaited him. He could tell his wife was in a foul mood. What had he done? Gemma only behaved like this when Bernie was in the doghouse. Bernie gingerly trotted over to Gemma and tried to kiss her affectionately on the cheek, but she brushed him away very sharply. She was stirring a pot of bolognese on the gas hob far too vigorously, and distinctly avoiding his gaze. The kitchen was filled with a delicious savoury scents of garlic and oregano, and Bernie could feel his stomach spasming. He hadn't realised how hungry he was until he walked into the house and smelt these lovely aromas. It was always good returning home to savoury home-cooked meals, but not to a cantankerous wife that was as prickly as a hedgehog, who seemed as amenable as a grumpy walrus. "What is wrong, love? Have I done something wrong? Why are you in such a capricious mood?" Gemma turned around to glare at Bernie furiously. "Why am I in a funny mood? You want to know why I'm in a funny mood? Do you really want to know? Because I don't think you should ask me that question, because I might give you an answer you don't want to hear." "Well, it's obvious, sweetheart, that I must have done something wrong to upset you. That is painfully clear to me. I'd like to remind you I've had a long day at the office, a hard day, a tiring day, and a rather uncomfortable journey home. So coming back to find you in such a truculent mood is hardly welcoming. I thought you were enjoying being at Dreamy Heights. You've been so positive of late." "So you've had an awful journey home? You poor, poor thing, Bernie, and a hard day at work," said Gemma, making a face. "I feel so sorry for you, Bernie, so sorry for you." "Gemma, stop being like this. Stop being so condescending. You're irking me now. What the hell is going on with you?" "You want to know what's going on with me, do you, Bernie? I'll tell you. I understand you told Mrs. Warmonger I was mentally ill, and she needed to check up on me to see if I was all right while you were at work, which, for your information, she's been doing all the time, at least once a day. It's getting on my nerves, Bernie. How dare you tell her about my postnatal depression? It's none of her business. I can't believe you would do something like that. Throwing my dirty laundry in her face. Why would you do that? I can't believe it." Gemma was so furious she threw a dirty wooden spoon at Bernie, the one that she'd been using to stir the bolognese sauce, so the steaming hot tomato juices splattered over his pristine white shirt, and the wooden spoon landed at his feet with a thud, barely missing his expensive crocodile shoes. Bernie reached down to pick up the wooden spoon, replacing it back on the countertop. He ignored the splatters of tomato sauce on his shirt that looked rather like blood, as if the incident had never happened. Bernie never liked to make a fuss. "Love, I confided in Mrs. Warmonger only because you're out here on your own. I wanted her to look out for you, that's all. I told her you'd been suffering from postnatal depression, but that you were so much better now. I asked her to keep an eye on you, because you're in a vulnerable space, are you not? I know we came here for a change of scene, and to get away from people, and for the peace and quiet. But it doesn't do any harm to have someone else watching your back, does it? And it certainly gives me peace of mind." "Peace of mind for you? That's what this is all about, isn't it, Bernie? Because I can't be trusted to look after myself, can I? You don't trust me. How dare you get that woman to snoop around me? That woman is a cow, a prize cow. I can't stand her. She has a nose as long as an anteater. What else did you tell her? Did you tell her the colour of my knickers by any chance? The brand of the shampoo I happen to use?" Bernie shook his head abashedly. "Please don't be like this, love. I'm sorry if I told Mrs. Warmonger about your postnatal depression. But I only had your very best interests at heart. I really did." "You're sorry, are you? Not as sorry as I am. Everywhere I go, I have a sense that interfering busybody is spying on me. She comes to the door every day, asking me if I'm all right. Do you realise how annoying that is? I wish she'd leave me the hell alone. I hate the hypocritical, judgmental expression she wears on her face all the time, as if she's condemning me for even daring to breathe." "You may be judging her too harshly, dear. I think you're being extremely unfair. I know she looks rather unapproachable and seemingly rather waspy, but I think that's kind of her to look out for you, love. I really do.
Kind? Is that what you call it? She's an interfering busybody, a nosy old cow. Do you know, I went for a short little stroll in the woods this morning. Well, I decided to leave Molly asleep in her cot. I knew I wouldn't be away for terribly long. I just wanted a break. I knew Molly would be safe on her own for a little while. And lo and behold, as I'm leaving for my walk, I see Mrs. High and Mighty, Mrs. Warmonger's curtains twitching. I knew she was watching me, I really did, having a good old gawk. When I got back from my walk on the beach, I could see her curtains twitching again. She couldn't resist to peer out at me. Oh, goodness gracious, I felt so intruded upon, as if she was interfering in my space. Moments later, she's at the front door again, asking me, "Is everything all right, dear?" I told her everything was fine.
Well, there you go there then, love. She was looking out for you. What harm is there in that? No harm done at all as far as I'm concerned. And I'm glad, if you must know, that she's watching over you, even though you're very much against her.
That's not all, Bernie. She went on to say she noticed I hadn't taken Molly with me on my walk. She said it wasn't a good idea to leave Molly on her own. She went on to say she was quite happy to look after Molly for me if I needed a break from her, and that she understood I might get overwhelmed at times.
Well, sweetheart, I think that was very kind of her to offer to babysit Molly for you. She was only looking out for you. Maybe you should take her up on her kind offer. Every mother needs a break from time to time. Besides, if the truth be told, I think Mrs. Warmonger is a very responsible woman, and I think she would take very good care of Molly.
Looking out for me? Is that what you call it, Bernie? I'm telling you, she's a busybody. There's something off about her. You know, the weirdest thing of all is when I came home, it looked like someone had changed Molly's diaper. She was wearing a different onesie, and the milk I'd pumped for her in the refrigerator that I put in a bottle wasn't there anymore. It had mysteriously just vanished. It occurred to me that maybe Mrs. Warmonger came into the house. She must have a spare key. She could have come in while I was on my walk and watched over Molly. I mean, it felt as if someone had been in the house. I really did feel that. When Gemma saw the somewhat aghast, disbelieving expression on her husband's face, she knew she should never have spoken about her fears, for they sounded completely irrational and almost groundless. Bernie was probably thinking she was losing her mind. I knew I shouldn't have told him what I was thinking. She scolded herself.
Gemma, you sound as if you're losing your mind. Either that or you're setting out to tear Mrs. Warmonger apart with your unkind words because you despise her so much. What has she ever done to you, love? It's not kind of you to make up stuff like this about people, just because you don't like them. I'm sure the woman means well, and underneath the hardened veneer that she presents to the world, there could be a teddy bear for all you know.
I doubt that very much, Bernie. I really do.
Furthermore, love, Mrs. Warmonger would not impose on our privacy, or come into our cottage like that, without our permission. The very idea is completely nonsensical. I'm sure there is a simple explanation for the diaper looking so clean. Maybe you did change Molly's diaper yourself, and forgot all about it. It happens. You get exhausted being a mother, and that's perfectly understandable. Nothing to be ashamed of. It's easy to become forgetful, vague, and confused. What about the time you were convinced you'd bought Molly that blanket from the baby shop, and it turned out you hadn't even put it in the shopping cart after all that? But you were so convinced that you had done so. You've been through an awful battle with your depression, love. It would make perfect sense that you can overlook stuff. More to the point, are you taking your medication, love?
What are you implying? That I'm going bonkers or something, Bernie? Of course I'm taking my medication, said Gemma stiffly. But maybe you're right, Bernie. Perhaps it was an oversight on my part. She said, the doubt in her voice becoming increasingly apparent. Maybe she was losing her mind, she thought, and determined to put the blame of her forgetfulness straight on to Mrs. Warmonger, just out of spite. It would be a very convenient thing for her to do. And Bernie was absolutely right. Even though Mrs. Warmonger was a prize cow, it wasn't fair to be so unkind about her.
Of course it was an oversight, love.
I think you're being very hard on Mrs. Warmonger. You're right. I probably shouldn't have told her about your postnatal depression, so I do apologise for that. I had no idea at the time that confiding in her about your condition would cause you so much undue distress. Lots of mothers, Gemma, suffer from postnatal depression, and I hope you realise that. It's not something to be remotely ashamed of. When I told Mrs. Warmonger about your condition, she was very concerned for your safety. Why? Did she think I was going to top myself or something, Bernie? No, love, but there are a lot of cliffs around here. Mrs. Warmonger thought...
She thought that I might throw myself down a cliff face, is that it?
Something like that, love, said Bernie. I'm sorry, but she was genuinely worried about you.
Gemma sighed. You're right. I'm overreacting. What am I like? I get so touchy about things these days. I guess it really got to me when Mrs. Warmonger was making scathing comments about my leaving Molly asleep in the cottage in her cot on her own. I felt like she was judging me so unfairly. I wanted to say to her that there is no one living close to us that would abduct my baby, apart from her, of course. I mean, if I was in San Francisco, I would never leave her alone. But out here it's completely different, is it not?
That may be, love. But she was just concerned, I'm most sure.
2 weeks had gone by at Dreamy Heights, and every time Gemma took a stroll on the beach, she kept little Molly strapped to her chest. She'd walk past Mrs. Warmonger's side of the cottage, and lo and behold, as you would expect, she'd see Mrs. Warmonger standing there clandestinely in the window, staring out at her, believing she wasn't being seen. The woman would cunningly hide behind her net curtains, which would be very telling, especially because they would begin to twitch. But Gemma knew she was being watched, and she didn't like that woman one single bit. It didn't help, of course, that every single day, like clockwork, Mrs. Warmonger was at her door asking, "Is everything all right, dear? I thought I needed to check up on you, just to be sure." And Gemma would say, "Yes, everything is fine, Mrs. Warmonger." What she really wanted to say is, "Why don't you leave me the hell alone?" Gemma made sure when she took her walk to the beach that she avoided the woodgrove like the plague from now on. And she was happy to take casual strolls across that small beach and spend her time paddling in the tingling ice-cold water or peering into rock pools to examine the sea life. She was glad she had not told Bernie about her outlandish encounter with the female Bigfoot, because he'd never have believed such wild claims for a single moment, and then he really would believe that she'd lost leave of her senses. If she'd told him about Grimala chasing after her and a female Bigfoot helping her escape, such an intimidating foe, he would think that Gemma was definitely off her rocker, because you couldn't make stuff like this up. Suffice to say, he would think that Gemma had fictitiously made everything up, and he would believe the medication that Dr. Sternberg had prescribed for her had made her hallucinate. Gemma couldn't blame him for that, of course. As if Bernie was to tell her a similar spaced-out story, she'd struggle to believe it too. Once you've had a mental breakdown of some kind and told someone something that sounded completely wacko, they would likely think you were completely delusional. Gemma was exceedingly glad that she had fastidiously remained tight-lipped about her rather bizarre interaction with the female Bigfoot. She reasoned it was probably a story she would take down with her to the grave, as there were some things it was not appropriate to share. Let's not kid, Grimala had been absolutely terrifying. Had the female Bigfoot not rescued her from that big bully, Gemma dreaded to think where she'd be right now, or if she'd be here at all. The thought did not bear thinking about. But thankfully the female Bigfoot had rescued her and brought her straight back to safety. The creature had assured her that Grimala did not impose a danger or a threat to her, provided she didn't go near his territorial patch again. "He's as volatile as a storm. Very, very possessive over his territory," she had told her. "In the morning he'll have forgotten all about you, I promise. He has a memory like a sieve. Grimala is quick to forget the grudges that he has against things. That's why his name is Stormy. He flies into a tangent and the storm passes and is then long forgotten about. But you don't want to get caught up in the eye of the storm with Grimala. If you stay away from him, he'll never bother you. He's actually quite lazy by nature. Indeed, if you don't go near his haunt, you'll never be troubled by him at all."
Don't worry, Gemma had thought. I'll never go down that footpath again. It was one afternoon when Gemma discovered to her horror that she'd run out of diapers. How had she allowed that to happen? She knew it would take her under 20 minutes to go to town and come back with the diapers that she needed, and so that's what she would do. Gemma was exhausted. She had not had any sleep the previous night, as little Molly had woken her up a plethora of times. Even Bernie had not enjoyed any sleep, and complained bitterly that he had had to get up early in the morning to commute to Coos Bay, and he didn't need little Molly robbing him of sleep, especially as he had a speech to give the following morning. "What's wrong with Molly tonight?" he had asked Gemma. "I don't know why she's being so disagreeable." When Gemma peered into the nursery and saw her baby girl lying fast asleep in the cot, she decided not to wake her up, but leave her sleeping. It was such a blissful relief to see Molly like this. And if she disturbed her by waking her up, then she'd have to bring her into town, and Molly would probably make a fuss. At the moment, baby Molly was being a nightmare. "I'll go into town, get the diapers, and hurry back home, and Molly won't even know I've been gone," she said to herself. But her in the cottage next door better not know I've left Molly at home on her own, or I'll never ever hear the end of it. I will make it look as if I'm carrying Molly on the front of my chest, just in case Mrs. Warmonger is watching me from the window, she thought. And I know she'll be watching me from the window. I want her to believe I've taken Molly into town with me. I really don't need judgment from the Wicked Witch of the West. No doubt she'll be dropping over to see me later, if she realises I haven't taken Molly with me, asking, "How are you, dear?" and saying something like, "Oh dear, I couldn't help but notice you didn't have Molly with you when you went into town, so I understand you left her behind in the house in her cot all on her own, and I strongly advise against that. Anything bad could have happened to her. I did tell you I was very happy to look after your baby for you, should you need some babysitting help. You only have to ask, my dear." "I'm sorry," said Gemma to herself under her breath, "but I think I'd rather the Grim Reaper watch over little Molly than you, Mrs. Warmonger." Gemma quickly scurried past Mrs. Warmonger's cottage and inwardly groaned as she saw Mrs. Warmonger's curtain twitch. Did that woman really have nothing better to do than to stare out of her window all day long, observing Gemma's every move? Was her life really that pitifully dull? Gemma was surprised to see Brandy, Mrs. Warmonger's cat, trotting nonchalantly over to her and rubbing his legs affectionately against Gemma and demanding to be petted. Mrs. Warmonger had been visibly shocked that Brandy had taken a distinct liking to Gemma. "It's very strange, it really is. He doesn't normally approve of strangers," she had said with some disdain. Gemma adored cats. She had bent down to stroke Brandy. Brandy began to purr profusely. Gemma bounced to her feet, realising that Mrs. Warmonger was still at the window watching her. She could feel the woman's formidable stares drill right through her. The witch had probably observed that Molly was not with her, and was now judging her, obviously. Too bad, thought Gemma. I've got to go into town to get those diapers, and frankly I don't care what Mrs. Warmonger thinks. If she noticed Molly isn't with me, I don't care about that either. In a tick, Gemma was in her car, driving away from Dreamy Heights. Mrs. Warmonger always knew when Gemma was leaving the cottage, because the young lady would lock up and make quite a noise about it. She had promised Bernie Songbird that she would keep a discreet eye on Gemma for him, and she was a woman of her word. I mean, Gemma had had postnatal depression, and she could see the woman walking past the window. She looked tired, and there were bags under her eyes. Gemma had certainly looked better. She was wearing an oversized sweater with a pair of tight leggings this afternoon. She looked rather flustered, and the epitome of a worn-out mother, Mrs. Warmonger thought. She wasn't remotely surprised by this. She had heard little Molly screaming all night long through the walls of her cottage. She could hear Gemma getting up during the night to attend to her baby's every need. She'd almost felt sorry for her. At the same time, she had been rather envious of Gemma, wishing with all her heart that she could be the one reassuring little Molly. "If I was taking care of that wee little one, I'd make sure she got to sleep very quickly." Mrs. Warmonger had got out of bed and trotted to her own nursery to play the role of a devoted mother. She had lovingly rocked Viola and Daisy in her arms, while she sat in a rocking chair, singing them a lullaby. She loved her real-life baby dolls, but she had not forgotten what it felt like to hold the real thing. There really was no comparison. Mrs. Warmonger had hoped that Gemma would take her up on allowing her to babysit little Molly from time to time, but she could see that Gemma wasn't having any of that. "It's not necessary, Mrs. Warmonger," Gemma had said in a clipped, rather guarded voice. "I can look after Molly myself. I don't need any help, but it's kind of you to offer." Mrs. Warmonger had tried to hide her disappointment, but not very well. She had said, "Well, you know where to find me, dear, if you do change your mind." Mrs. Warmonger knew that Gemma would never change her mind. She knew Gemma's type all too well. Where was she going in such a tearing rush, she wondered. She could see Molly appeared to be strapped to her front. Mrs. Warmonger's attention was distracted as she observed her cat Brandy trotting over to Gemma. She couldn't help but feel betrayed by her cat. She had always got a macabre kind of pleasure from the fact that Brandy was not remotely friendly to well-meaning strangers and would usually lash out at them with a claw and had been known to draw blood. But Brandy seemed to really like Gemma, and this irked Mrs. Warmonger. She frowned as Gemma bent over to stroke Brandy. Her unfaithful, disloyal cat was treacherously lapping up the affection that Gemma bestowed on him with an ebullient enthusiasm. She couldn't help but feel cheated and rather possessive towards Brandy. She wanted to run outdoors, grab her cat away from Gemma and say, "He's mine! Please don't touch him!" She felt distinctly irritated with Brandy for being so drawn to Gemma. Cats were supposed to be discerning animals, but Brandy obviously completely overlooked the young woman's shortcomings. All of a sudden Mrs. Warmonger noticed that Molly was not attached to Gemma's chest, like she had initially first believed. The way Gemma had been walking, she had assumed that Molly had been strapped to her front, but she could see that Gemma was going off somewhere without the baby. Little Gemma must still be in the cottage, lying there in her cot. So Gemma was going off somewhere without her baby. What kind of a mother does that make her? It was absolutely shocking, she thought. Did Gemma not realize how incredibly lucky she was to have a baby? Why were mothers who have babies that were popping out of their womb like money from a slot machine sometimes so nonchalant and indifferent about their own children? As far as Mrs. Warmonger was concerned, it was exceedingly negligent, leaving little Molly alone for God knows how long. Even though Mrs. Warmonger was loath to admit it, there was a twinge of excitement in her heart as Gemma climbed into the red Peugeot that she rented from the Trustlers and drove away. The moment she was out of sight, Mrs. Warmonger quickly grabbed the spare key to Gemma's cottage and burst through the front door, making a quick dash for the nursery. She couldn't wait to hold little Molly in her arms again. Gemma should never have left Molly unattended, she told herself. "I'm just watching over the baby for a while she's away," Mrs. Warmonger said to herself, opening the nursery, while her heart flapped in excitement as she looked at the quiet little bundle lying fast asleep in the cot. She had never felt this level of excitement when she observed Viola and Daisy lying in their cots, but then again they weren't real. "Hello, Molly. It's me, sweetheart. It's Peggy. How are you?" she said, staring down into the cot at little Molly, with a big, triumphant smile on her face. Molly was fast asleep, but Mrs. Warmonger put a gentle hand on the baby, and little Molly suddenly opened her eyes and began to chuckle happily, her chubby arms reaching out to Mrs. Warmonger's. Mrs. Warmonger's heart melted as she lifted little Molly out of the cot and swaddled her gently in her arms. "You're so beautiful, Molly," she purred. "How could your mum go and leave you like this, all on your own? Don't you worry, my love. I'm here for you. I'll look after you while Mummy's away. What do you think about that?" Molly looked at Mrs. Warmonger with bright blue eyes and chuckled again. Mrs. Warmonger may have been a formidable woman to many, but babies always responded to her in a positive way. "I tell you what, Molly, it's a lovely day outside. How about I take you on a little trip to the beach?" She could see Gemma's strap-on baby carrier hanging on the side of the closet, and she strapped little Molly to her front and sashayed out of the cottage, closing the front door discreetly behind her. She was taking a risk, of course she was, taking little Molly out like this, because she wasn't sure how long Gemma would likely be in town. But she reckoned she had a good 40 minutes to enjoy being with the baby, and she'd make the most of it. Mrs. Warmonger had no idea that Gemma's trip to town was going to be a hasty one. It was such a prepossessing day. The sun was shining brightly from a very blue sky, and the ocean had never been more turquoise. And as Mrs. Warmonger strolled along the beach with baby Molly, her chest expanded with joy, a joy that she'd never experienced before. When Gemma arrived home, she was surprised to see that as she walked past Mrs. Warmonger's house, there was no one twitching at the curtains, and no feeling of being watched. Brandy was sitting there on the doorstep, giving himself a good old preening session, and seeing Gemma, he hurriedly trotted over to her, purring again profusely. Gemma dropped down to her knees to cradle the cat, hoping the disapproving Mrs. Warmonger was not secretly watching her from behind a net curtain, fussing over little Brandy, because she disapproved of the relationship that Gemma had with her cat. But Gemma couldn't help herself. She had a soft spot for Brandy. It was as she reached the house she was shocked to find in broad daylight the female Bigfoot she had previously encountered 2 weeks ago, standing outside her part of the cottage, as if waiting for her. Was this about Grimala, Gemma wondered? Was Grimala still after her or something? Gemma felt no fear as she approached the female Bigfoot. It was like seeing an old friend again. This Bigfoot had saved her life. But she noticed the Bigfoot seemed agitated as she kept glancing towards the beach and then back at Gemma with a worried look in her eyes. She was pointing to the beach with an overlong arm. She began to speak so furiously fast. Even the words that came into Gemma's head were all jumbled and confused. Gemma waved her hand and said, "Please slow down. I can't understand what you're saying. Is everything all right? It's not Grimala, is it? He's not after me. Kotola pika, hakita lakita, motola pani. Akulo, aki sanaka." The female Bigfoot cocked her head to one side, and thankfully her speech slowed down. Kolotolo Grimala kilatilako, aki santua. Grimala's long since forgotten about you. You don't need to fear him. I came here to tell you not to be alarmed. I'm a mother myself. I know what we can be like. But I need to tell you she's taken your baby onto the beach. "Who has taken my baby?" asked Gemma. "Who?" "The old woman. I knew you'd be worried, so I didn't want you to panic. Your baby's perfectly safe. Just don't be too hard on the old woman. She means well. Her heart's in the right place. She's had a hard life, and her heart is very empty. Be kind to her. She'll never hurt your baby. She loves your baby." And with that the Bigfoot gave her another nod and glided away and was gone from her sight. Gemma was furious as she processed what the Bigfoot had told her. Mrs. Warmonger has my baby on the beach, thought Gemma, the fury bubbling up in her chest. She wanted to scream, she was that mad. I knew that woman was deranged. I knew it. And she'd been into the house before. I wasn't imagining things after all. Gemma ran down the rocky slope to the beach. She dropped her bag of diapers at the front door, and then she saw Mrs. Warmonger rocking little Molly in her arms. The woman looked animated. "What the hell are you doing with my baby, Mrs. Warmonger?" said Gemma, storming up to the old woman. "How dare you take Molly from my house? Give her back to me now!" Mrs. Warmonger obediently handed little Molly back to Gemma. "I'm so sorry, dear, but you abandoned your baby when you went off to town, and I didn't think that was a good idea, so I decided to look after her while you were out. It's not good to leave your baby unsupervised. I'm sure you know that." "How dare you, Mrs. Warmonger? How dare you? Who do you think you are? You have no right to enter my house without my permission." Mrs. Warmonger suddenly burst into tears. Gemma did not expect this. She was confounded. She was seeing a side to the old woman she had never seen before. Perhaps she was not such a hard battle-axe after all. "I'm sorry, Gemma. I'm a silly old woman. Very silly. Oh, I don't know why I did what I did. I should mind my own business, shouldn't I? But your baby Molly is so beautiful, and I wanted to make sure she was all right. I didn't mean her any harm. I promise you I didn't. And it was wrong to walk into your house. Of course I know that. I don't know what I was thinking." Gemma found herself softening. She remembered the Bigfoot's words. She's had a hard life. She means no harm to your baby. She loves your baby. You're so lucky, Mrs. Warmonger continued. You have no idea how lucky you are, Gemma dear, to have such a perfect little girl. I was never able to have children of my own, you know. And with that, Mrs. Warmonger began to sob and sob. She was inconsolable with grief, and Gemma realised that Mrs. Warmonger was battle-weary. Her hard veneer had all been just a front. Mrs. Warmonger, I tell you what. Please calm down. Please don't cry. I can't bear it when people cry. Come back to the cottage with me. How about I make you a cup of sweet tea? It would seem that Gemma's relationship with Mrs. Warmonger did a complete 180 when she realised how much the old woman was actually hurting. It was over warm cups of sweet tea that Mrs. Warmonger told Gemma her heartbreaking story of how her husband had abandoned her after she could have no children. I was utterly devastated, she confided in Gemma. I felt so useless, so lost, so hopeless. Helpless as well. Honestly, I did. It was like there was nothing left in my life to live for. I bought myself a couple of real-life dolls, you know, so that I could pretend to be a mother. Isn't that pathetic? No, it's not. I can understand, Mrs. Warmonger. You were hurting badly. That's understandable. Well, when you came along to Dreamy Heights, and I saw Molly for the very first time, I hated you, Gemma, for having the life I always wanted for myself. A dream that was never to be for me. I'm an old woman now. I know I shouldn't have gone into your house to look in on Molly, but I really couldn't help myself. She's so spectacularly beautiful, isn't she? Here, why don't you hold her? Said Molly, handing the baby to Mrs. Warmonger, who took her gratefully and began to rock baby Molly in her arms. Oh, it's just so kind of you to let me hold her, Gemma. When I took her in my arms for the first time, do you know what I felt like? I felt like a dead tree in the winter that had just come back to life in the spring. I've never felt so much joy as I'm feeling now as I hold her. When you went off today to town, and I realised you hadn't taken Molly with you, I persuaded myself I was checking on the baby. The truth was, I wanted to hold her in my arms again, like I'm doing right now. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Warmonger, to hear your sad story. I really misjudged you. Yet you do know. Going into the house was the wrong thing to do. You should never have done that, even if your heart was in the right place. You do realise that? Of course I do, Gemma. And I'm so sorry. Really I am. You're not going to report me to the police, are you? I guess I deserve it if you do. As if, said Gemma, rolling her eyes. You didn't mean Molly any harm, Mrs. Warmonger. She really likes you. And you're right. She shouldn't have been left on her own. I'll let you take care of my baby from time to time. Sometimes I do need a break, and I know she'll be safe in your charge. I can see how much you care for her. And being a mother is very exhausting. You would really let me do that, said Mrs. Warmonger, after everything I did? I don't understand you, Gemma. Most mothers, well, they would completely lose it with me. But you're not like that at all. No wonder my Brandy likes you so much. That cat of mine has never warmed to visitors that have come to stay at Dreamy Heights before. But the moment he saw you, Gemma, he took to you at once. He's always been a very discerning cat. I was naturally furious about it because I felt betrayed by him. Because you had a baby, and I had a cat, and the cat was showing you more affection than he was showing me. But now I see why he likes you so much. You're not judgmental, Gemma, even though you have every right to be so. Mrs. Warmonger, I'm afraid that's not true. I've been extremely judgmental. I've falsely assumed you're a bitter old cow who was always putting her nose where it didn't belong. But I got you so terribly wrong. I can see that you care for Molly, and so, of course, I will let you take care of her. But what about Mr. Songbird? Are you going to tell him what I did? If you do, he'll probably drag me to the police station or leave this place in a tick, and I couldn't blame him for that. In his shoes, I'd likely do the very same. What he doesn't know won't hurt him. He thinks I'm being unreasonable about you all along." Before long, Gemma and Mrs. Warmonger became very good friends, and Gemma asked Mrs. Warmonger to be her daughter's goddaughter. The couple loved being on the Oregon coast, so much so that they moved to Coos Bay permanently, and Gemma visited Mrs. Warmonger as often as she could. And Mrs. Warmonger looks these days as if she's younger and sprightlier. There is a happy glow to her face, and gone is the formidable, unapproachable woman Gemma had first met. Despite the generation gap between the two women, they have become extremely close, and if Gemma had been a betting woman, she'd never believed that that was remotely possible. As for the Bigfoots, Gemma left the woods well alone, but she's quite sure Grimala is out there watching over his territory with a stormy determination. So woe betide anyone that dared encroach on his tiny snippet of the coastline. It was the female Bigfoot that had enabled Gemma to have a more open heart towards Mrs. Warmonger, for she made Gemma realise that the woman was hurting from a loss that had enslaved her life and made her grievously bitter. Gemma believed the lonely old woman, on whom life had dealt such a cruel blow, did of course deserve a second chance. And maybe in an idiosyncratic way, God had heard her prayers after all. For you can love a baby that is not your own, as if it was your own. There are no restrictions to the power of love. The good news is, after Gemma's 6 months at the coast, before they moved to Coos Bay, she was able to go off her medications that Dr. Sternberg had prescribed for her, and these days she is as bright and a sunnier person as she always was. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. I so enjoyed that. Until next time, goodbye and good night.